Hello, this is our first of two videos linking macroeconomic theory to the banking crisis. Now, to explain the macroeconomics, the economics behind the banking crisis, we need to look at money, banking, unemployment and inflation. And essentially we need to explain why it is that the banking sector is such paramount importance to the economy. For example, the government did rescue banks in the UK. It rescued Lloyds Bank and the Royal Bank of Scotland and of course Northern Rock. Whereas it did not rescue other companies, for example the large retail chain Woolworths, which went bankrupt some years ago. So there's something distinctly different about the banks and the banking sector, which means that a modern economy requires these to make it work. And that's, in these two videos, that's what we're doing. Now, just a few words on the link between these videos and the lectures, or indeed the lecture slides. While on the videos I'll be using a lot of the same material, indeed a lot of the same lecture slides, what I'm saying may not exactly coincide with what you hear in lectures. And so the best way to use these videos is to use them as an additional resource. Back up your notes, which you may have gained in the lectures, and to back up your notes you're reading from other materials. But don't expect these videos to be an exact copy of what's going to happen in the lectures. Okay, if we move on. Now we start with a very, very simple picture of the macroeconomy, the economy as a whole. This thing is supposed to represent, say, the complete UK economy. And we start off with just two sectors, a productive sector that's represented by the factory here, and a consumption sector represented by households, the house in this case. Now in this economy, the assumption is, and of course this is economics so we always start with assumptions, the assumption is that the households, the people own everything. So the households supply productive services and factors of production to the productive sector. So households supply labour to the factories. Households supply factory space, they rent perhaps buildings, perhaps land to the productive sector to produce things and so on. And the households also supply all the raw materials. So in return for this, the households get the consumption goods. The factories turn out the cars, the bicycles, the washing machines, the TVs, the iPods, blah, so on and so forth, and they're delivered to the household. So the circular flow has two circuits here. One is the physical flows of goods and services. In this diagram it's the black lines going around. The other is the flow of money. And of course, if you think about this, the flow of money, it goes exactly in the opposite direction to the flow of services. So households are paid for their supply of labour. That's your income, your wages, your income and so on. Factories pay landowners for renting their land to build factories on. Factories pay dividends to shareholders and so on. On the other hand, consumers, the households, buy the product produced by the productive sector. They buy the washing machines, the TVs, the iPods and so on. So the money goes in exactly the opposite direction to the flow of goods and services. Now, as I said, this is a very simple picture, and we'll now try and make this more realistic by adding more sectors effectively to this. Now, what I've done here is I've essentially added three other sectors, using the term fairly loosely, to the productive flow. We now, not only do we have households, we have the productive sector itself, the factories, but we now have some almost intermediaries, banks, the banking sector, which of course is our keen interest here, the government sector, and what is described here as the abroad sector, which basically means how we deal with exports and imports. Now, the other thing to understand about this particular diagram is it only shows half the flows that the original diagram showed. The original diagram showed both the physical flows and the money flows. This diagram now is only showing the money flows. That's for practical reasons. I just can't get enough stuff on the slide, but also it's because what we're actually interested here is the flow of money. We are trying to explain why the banking sector had a problem, and so we need to concentrate on the money flows. So getting back to this diagram, we see that households don't immediately spend all their money on products produced by the productive sector. So households don't go out and spend all their wages on local produce things. They save some of their wages. That's the S thing, the saving going into the banks. I'm using banks, by the way, as a fairly generic term to mean any institution that deals with savings and investments. Also, households pay taxes. We pay income taxes, purchase taxes, excise duty and things like cigarettes and alcohol and so on. So we pay taxes. And also, we spend some of our money on imported stuff. Not everything we buy is actually produced within the economy. So for example, I mean, if you are actually purchasing an iPod, that would be an import. iPods are not produced in the UK. Most washing machines, most TVs and things, a lot of the things we'd actually buy, electronic goods in general, are not produced in the UK, so they would be imports. So in some sense, those things are withdrawals, they're leakages from the circular flow of income. Now they're balanced, possibly, by investments. The banks, if we take this very simple story, the banks take our money and they have to loan it out again. They invested in the economy in some way. They invested in perhaps making loans to factories to produce more stuff. The government takes their taxes and use those taxes to spend on things like subsidising education, building schools, repairing roads, building railways, that sort of stuff. Also, the final thing here is that the productive sector, exports some of the materials. Just as we buy products produced from abroad, our factories, our productive sector, exports material. Now, perhaps the awkward thing here is, given that we're looking at the money flows, the money is flowing back into the factories in this case, because we're not looking at the physical flows of goods and services, we're looking at where the money goes. So that's why it's coming back. Now, I now look at the banking sector in a bit more detail, but first of all, I suppose I need to explain something about the condition for economic equilibrium. This is a very simple picture here. Basically, we're saying that the stuff that's withdrawn from the economy, the withdrawals, has to match the injections, the things going back into the economy, for this thing to actually be in equilibrium. So in other words, if we add the amount of savings the economy does, the amount of taxes that the government takes, the amount of money we spend on imports, for an economy to be in equilibrium, that has to match the amount of investment going from the banking system into the productive sector, the amount of spending by the government on the productive sector, and the amount of exports by the productive sector to other countries. So as long as those things are equal, as long as savings, tax and expenditure and imports are equal, investment, government expenditure and money made from the value of exports, as long as those things are in equilibrium, the economy is stable. Broadly speaking, we would then go on to say that this means the economy is at something like full employment equilibrium. Indeed, that was the understanding for a long time until the 1940s, that the economy had to be in full employment equilibrium. We now have a slightly more sophisticated understanding that perhaps the economy doesn't have to be in full employment equilibrium to be stable. But nevertheless, that, I'm afraid, is an argument for another day. It's something you will deal with in further modules where you deal with macroeconomics. So we move on from there now to focus down more closely on the banking sector. Essentially, I've gone back to the two slides and to have a look at the traditional banking sector. Now, you know, I'm still taking liberties here with the thing, because in order to make the thing fairly simple, I've split the banking sector just into two sections. One section, which I've labelled here, the building societies and the high street banks. What I'm saying here is these are sections pretty much closely focused on consumers. The investment bank is a part of the banking system that's focused on productive sector, on generating investments, on dealing with stocks and shares and so on. If we go back to the building society and the high street banks, now remember, this is the situation that pertained in most economies, including the UK, up to sometime mid-80s, I'd imagine. So the biggest thing that building societies and high street banks did in terms of consumer lending up to then was to deal with mortgages. Consumers obtain mortgages from the high street banks, or very likely from building societies, who were back in the 60s and 70s, and pay those off over a very long period of 20 to 30 years. And of course, the household sector also saved in the banking system. Now, what I'm saying in this diagram is that not all the saving went into the blue rectangle, the building society and the high street banks. Some of it went into investment banks. Now, investment banks were the part of the banking system that dealt with stocks and shares, took risks, invested in companies in some way, actually in a rather sort of second order way, I suppose. But one thing to understand here is the confusion is that I've got savings going into the investment bank from households. Now, normally when people think of households, they think of people with normal jobs who do small amounts of saving in a building society or bank. But in fact, in this diagrammatic representation of the economy, the household sector includes, for example, the very rich factory owners, the owners of, I don't know, Cadbury's or somebody, and part of their income would be effectively invested again in the productive sector, and that's the S that's going back into the investment banks. So now this picture is not entirely accurate, but it's close enough to represent what was happening here. Up to deregulation, building society and high street banks basically dealt with low risk ways of dealing with money, and the biggest thing they did as far as consumers was concerned, not the only thing, but for the biggest loans they offered were mortgages for new homes, and that dealt with, for that they got mortgage repayments which tended to extend over a long time and so on.